ladies and gentlemen, we'll allow our friends from the media a few moments of time to get their photographs in. And in a few moments' time, we'll be handing over for our session 3, which will be a televised roundtable summit. And we are honored to have with us our friends from CNBC, and we'll hand over shortly to Martin Sung, who's an anchor with CNBC.
Thank you. Good morning. Most important thing first, housekeeping. Can you all hear me, especially in the back? Could you get my mic turned up? That would be helpful. Could we have a bit of technical assistance here?
They can hear you.
We all shout. We can hear you, Martin.
Let's continue taking pictures while we sort out my microphone. Can we have some help here? Yeah, thank you.
Do we turn them on?
Okay, we're not off to a good start
There
here.
you go.
Can we,
Now it's working.
I think it's working.
It's working now.
It's working.
working? Yes?
Yes.
Is it working?
Okay.
Excellent, good. Okay. Just warming up. All right, so folks, good morning. Selamat pagi. On behalf of APEC and also CNBC, a pleasure to be here with you. I'm very excited. We've got a great panel organized for you for this session. We're going to spend about an hour with you folks, an hour plus. And what this is going to be is two things in one. We're going to be doing a live event with all of you. And in addition, this is going to be a television event as well. And what I mean by that is, in the past, these APEC panels have been captured on cameras, but they've only had very, very limited distribution as far as I understand. This time around, though, this is going to be seen on CNBC, so distribution throughout Asia, a lot of the US, some of Europe as well. So this is, I think, quite historic for us as well as for APEC, so I'm very proud to be part of that. You are going to be helping us make television history as well. We want to involve you as much as we can. We've, as always, dedicated a little bit of time towards the end to get you all in. I'm pretty sure there are microphones around, or they'll be coming to you. So towards the end, we'll take questions, comments also from the floor. Please feel free, don't be shy. I only ask a couple of things. One, tell us who you are, where you're from, and who you represent, and also who your question or comment is directed towards. That would be very useful for us. Okay, so basically today we're here talking about growth. Is there growth? Yes. Is there enough of it? No. Where do we find that extra growth? How do we find that extra growth? Who does it come from? From the government, from the private sector, through trade agreements, or what? So this is very big and broad. We can roam far and wide, and I'd be very interested. We were warming up earlier on in the holding room, and I already heard a lot of very interesting ideas from Chris and from all our panelists, in fact. So if we're ready, let's get this thing underway. Small bit of housekeeping. Communications devices, cell phones, iPhones, Blackberries, etc. If you could, we would appreciate if you could turn them off just for the duration of this panel. If you really have to keep them on, then silent would be ideal, just so it doesn't interrupt what we're doing. And just to let you know, I mean, if they're left on, sometimes they can interfere with the equipment, and then that's not such a good thing. Okay? All right, fantastic. We are just about all set. So, do we have some videos to play? Okay, we're still counting down. We've got about a minute to go. Let me quickly, there's our sound.
During the session, the auditorium doors will remain closed. If you have any questions, please ask a member of the crew. Please switch off your mobile phone and refrain from using flash photography. again, please ensure your mobile phone is switched off. It's been 5 years since the global financial crisis took the foundations of the world's economy. Today, global growth is starting to regain momentum, and fundamentals are looking solid, thanks in large part to the world's twin engines of growth, China and the U.S. But concerns about America's tight labor market and China's shadow banking system continue to daunt those nations. And with the emerging market economy now starting to evolve, our traditional drivers of growth no longer applicable. Over the next hour, we'll talk about the future growth program and offer GPS for growth.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sebastian Pinero, President of Chile. Deripaska, Finance Minister of Indonesia. Chris Weidner, CEO of Senate. Oleg Deripaska, Chairman of the Supervisory Board, Basic Government. And now, your host, GMC, Martin Song.
Hello, folks. Welcome to this special debate here at the APEC Summit on growth. You've been introduced to our panelists. Let's get this right underway. And let me start out of, because of protocol and also out of respect, with Mr. President Pinera there. When you think about growth, you have a unique perspective, I think, because in less than 2 months, you will more likely than not be leaving office, if I'm not correct. So it might be easier for you to say a lot of things now than it was, let's say, at the beginning of your term. It's an amazing story, your country, Chile, but it is also a bit of a one-trick pony, is it not? Copper and China. You need to diversify, obviously. You need to keep more value added at home. You need to deal with immediate problems of inflation. I know. Growth going forward, though, if you had advice for whoever is taking over from you, what would you be telling them about development and growth in Chile?
Thank you very much, Martin. First of all, don't shorten my period. I still have 6 months to go. Let me answer your question. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain, the world has enjoyed 2 decades which can be considered golden period in terms of growth. Growth was everywhere, in the US, in Europe, in the Asian giants like China and India, which were growing at a pace of more than 10%, and also in the emerging economies. But something happened in 2008, which changed things to the worst. Since then, the economy has been going through very difficult times, and as you are fully aware, Europe is growing very little, almost nothing. The US recovery is weaker and less stable than predicted. The Asian giants are not growing at 10% or more. And the emerging world, of course, is receiving the effects. What I think has to be done in order to recover our capacity to grow at 5% or more, which was the average growth rate during those 2 golden decades. I think that very many things and very different things have to be addressed. First of all, in the case of Europe, of course, they will have to face their fiscal deficit and their banking problems, because they were consuming more than that they were producing, and that's something that sooner or later you will have to face. In the case of the US, I think that they will have to face, and in a better way than they are doing it now with shutting down the government, their fiscal and current account deficit. In the case of the Asian giants, of course, they will have to face their trade surplus and their banking sector. In the case of countries like Chile and many underdeveloped or developing countries, by the way, Chile has a main target mission to become a developed country without poverty before the end of this decade. Since we are growing at an average of 6% per year, if we keep growing at that pace, we will be able to achieve that. What has to be done? I think that we will need to build 4 new pillars, which are not only necessary for Chile, but for many other Latin Americans and developing economies. First, we need to increase dramatically the quality of our human capital. And for that, we need to undertake a huge educational reform. Otherwise, we won't be able to be part of the science and knowledge society. Second, we need to foster innovation and entrepreneurship. Third, we need to double or triple our investment in science and technology. And fourth, we need to address the poverty problem and to create a society with more equality of opportunity. Those new 4 pillars are the basic target of the government that I preside. And I think that if we are able and we are successful in building or strengthening those pillars, Chile will be able to become the first, hopefully not the only, Latin American country able to join the club of the countries that have been able to compatibilize growth, progress, democracy, and peace.
Okay, this is very interesting, Mr. President. Thank you very much, because right now Chile is already the most affluent Latin American country, and per capita income growth has literally, over the last 10 years, exploded. So this is very interesting. Pak Khatib, let me come to you on this. Interesting. I at first talked about Chile, one-trick pony, copper, and China, right? When I think of Indonesia, obviously very commodities-based as well, but I've heard from your officials, from you as well just a couple of minutes ago, your dream, looking ahead, of being a knowledge economy. When I heard these comments, and I have to let you know, this was another cabinet-level official several years ago, talk about this, I really had to scratch my head, because I hadn't heard such ambitious goals since the days of Habibie, if you folks remember him, right? We're talking about a quantum leap, are we not?
Well, first of all, I think we have to look at about the global context as well. In the past 4 years, after the global financial crisis, many emerging economies benefited by this quantitative easing and also the high boom of this commodity and energy prices. But looking at the recent development that US, for example, producing a shale gas, which somehow will change the equilibrium of the energy balance all over the world. And this
Is it going to kill the commodity cycle?
Well, if you look at in the past 10 years, for example, there is a positive correlations between energy prices and commodity prices. So a changing of the global structure somehow will also affect Indonesia. A country like Indonesia, we cannot continue only rely on these raw materials and the cheap labor. And in order to anticipate this, and I can see I'm not talking about the 5 years development, it's probably about 10 to 15 years, something that we really need to prepare. I share President Pinera's view, is about the role of the innovations, about the human capital. That is why from the beginning now, as a Minister of Finance, I start to provide an incentive. The tax credit, for example, if the investor would like to invest on industry or sector, we just do the R&D in Indonesia. We provide an incentive for doing a training in Indonesia. This is a preparation, but when I'm talking about this role of innovation and technology, knowledge-based economy, I'm not talking that we immediately jump into the, for example, the really high tech. You can start something with a very, something really on the ground. For example, like on the garment business. It's very hard to compete for Indonesia to compete with Bangladesh with the cheap garment. But we can move into the next stage of development by introducing design, fashion, and we find a niche market. This is the role of the human capital become very important and crucial. And this is the way I look at the future of Indonesia. Of course, when we are talking about this, moving to the next stage of development, we cannot do, the great leap, the quantum leap, because this needs to be supported by the good macroeconomic policy, by the feasible, about comparative advantage as well. And one thing I would like to share with you as well, Martin, in the future, the comparative advantage of the country will be no longer a physical asset, but will be intangible, including the government policy. So if we are moving into that direction, it means that the government needs to provide a conducive investment climate, streamlining regulations, good macroeconomic stability. I do understand that nowadays some emerging markets, including Indonesia, are facing a turbulence due to the financial market. But the way I look at it, in the past 4 years, we were living in the situation which is unnormal. because the emerging market enjoy the quantitative easing, the unconventional monetary policy. Now we have to look at the situation, the world without QE. It means that we are back into normal situation. And if you recall the world without QE at the time, the yield of the US T-bills was around 3 to 3.5%. Now the situation is back. There will be a probably raising of the long-term interest rate in the US. The emerging market need to adjust. But if you're talking beyond this short-term turbulence, then now we'll see that the future among the Asian Pacific member economies that will be there, including resources, including consuming class, the growing middle class, and the most important one is moving to the next stage of development into the knowledge economy.
Interesting. Okay, Pak, we'll come back to you in just a little bit. But Oleg, let me bring you in on this. You're obviously a resources guy, commodities, Rusal, aluminum, or alumina. And we were talking a couple of minutes ago in the holding room, and you were saying that, look, the story for commodities, for resources, is far from dead. In fact, smart, wise investment policy can translate into the goals that both Pak Khatib as well as Mr. President were talking about. Human capital, correct?
But you cannot develop human capital without proper problem to solve. You need to build infrastructure. You can't attract money enough to build infrastructure without project. And processing of raw materials is important driver to develop infrastructure. And we're very interested in Indonesia at the moment, and especially the way they try to guide and create roadmap for development of resource sector. Yes, many people call it resource nationalism, but in my view, it's just wise step and opportunity for Indonesia to size a lot of investment. And the way they could develop processing industry will actually create opportunity to develop infrastructure, to build any significant metal mining operation. You need ports, roads, power plants, you need to develop grid, and of course the people. We'll see we already saw a few projects here, and it's a great opportunity to train people on this project. Another opportunity which China developed recently, industrial development in China, create a chance for newcomers in processing in industry, build per ton of capacity cheapest and most efficient plant which ever we saw, and it's a great opportunity to.
I have to ask you, Oleg, bluntly, as a major player in commodities, does it matter to you if Indonesia, let's not call it resource nationalism or economic nationalism, does it matter to you that they're trying to keep more of the value added at home?
Of course it's matter. We can invest with them and with local partners. We can develop this plants more efficient because we know the market. We control technology ourselves. And in my view, Indonesia it's key not just for in a lot of resources in tin, nickel, aluminum, iron ore, but also for China. But it also would be key supplier for India as well in 9 years.
Okay.
And in my view, this policy, and I think more countries should encourage this policy, could also take in consideration intergovernment relation. We see, we saw recent visit of Chinese leaders and contract which was signed based on this guidance. It's $22 billion contracts. We can see more improvement in proper pricing arrangement, because at the moment it's not fair. Country favored export and import raw materials without processing, and they're not favored process product, which I think should be deal through the arrangement in trading partnership and also sort of new agreements. And in my view, of course, the pricing should be adjusted, because at the moment price mechanism based on London and LME cover only all trade. We can't see how Asia would be an Asian demand and supply would be implemented.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of improvement could be done.
Oleg has a bit of a beef with the LME, which we'll get back to in just a bit. But let's swing all the way from commodities over to pharma, big pharma, and life sciences, and talk about the TPP. It's unfortunate, obviously, that President Obama could not be with us. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, I think everybody in this room would agree that much as the U.S. would have preferred otherwise, the reality is, look, we were never going to get a deal at APEC. It was never going to be announced here. But let me ask you this. There are worries that the TPP and provisions to do with intellectual property that affect big pharma would put a lot of the poorer or the poorest people in this part of the world, or at least among signatory countries, at a disadvantage. They wouldn't be able to get the medicine they needed through generics because under the TPP, patent protection would possibly extend beyond the normal 20 years. For you, Sanofi, right? You guys are French, not part of this at all. If TPP were to go through, would it put you at a disadvantage or an advantage? I'm curious.
Well, I think we have to look at this from the broader picture. What is actually the prize that we're going after?
Yeah.
You know, to take on from President Pinera's 4 pillars. I give you the example of 2 countries, Jamaica and Singapore. In the 1960s, both had similar populations, both had GDP per capita of around $2,200. Today, the GDP per capita of Jamaica is $5,400, and the per capita GDP for Singapore is $59,000. Now, Singapore is not a country where there's an awful lot of natural resources, and Singapore has made a huge investment in science and technology education, has built an impressive biotechnology facility, has built impressive research facilities. So I think, you know, what we're really looking at, there is an element which is related to economic growth that very much correspond to these 4 pillars. And therefore, I think enhancing intellectual property only serves to protect the ideas of those people that we've been investing in. Now, that does not mean, by any means, that we can forget about access to care. That is absolutely critical. And we have seen this in numerous circumstances around the world, and we have to find models of ensuring that care is delivered. But care is not just drugs. You know, I was in India last week. We recited the example of a woman who died of cancer. The drug was available for free in the hospital, but she couldn't get into the hospital. So there is an element where we also have to focus on building healthcare infrastructure. Now, the president raised an extremely important point, which was we also have to get the health of people better. Because right now, at least in developed countries, 3/4 of our healthcare budget are going to the management of chronic disease, many of which are preventive. And yet, if you look at our healthcare systems, we spend very little in terms of actual prevention. In fact, we actually have sick care systems because all of the resources are going to when someone gets sick. But we don't keep enough, we don't spend enough to keep people well. If you do that, you can actually release some of the resources that are going to diseases like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and actually invest then in those things that we can't prevent. And the second thing is, I think this industry has been extremely advanced in thinking about different models. We already have tiered pricing across countries where we price according to income per capita. And we have within the Gates Roundtable, which I have the privilege of co-chairing with Bill Gates, models in 2 countries where we're looking at differentiated pricing within a country, because within many emerging markets, we're seeing significant disparities of income. And therefore, really, the access issue isn't for the whole population, it is for targeted populations.
Okay, Chris, hold that thought. We're going to take a quick break on our debate here on the future forward, or the way forward for growth here at the APEC Summit. We're coming right back.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. Part 2 of TV Extra Growth continues shortly.
Can I come to you when we start again? Yeah. Can we talk about WTO versus TPP, RCEP, and Indonesia's position? Welcome back to the APEC Summit and our discussion on growth, the way forward. And let me pick up with Khatib here and talk about trade agreements as a way to drive growth. Here at the summit, of course, TPP still under discussion, still hotly debated, very controversial as well. China, of course, has its model, the RCEP, but Indonesia as host country is still, seems like it's hell-bent on making sure that Doha acts in December. But, you know, people take a look at Doha and what it has achieved, or rather not, and say, look, 20 years since then, we've had the internet, we've had a lot of other stuff, social media, and this thing is so outdated. Why stick with trying to keep Doha alive?
Well, I think it is important to solve the problem through the multilateral, because there are many sensitive issues you cannot discuss only through the regional. For example, let me give an example about agriculture. If you're talking about the sensitivity issue on the agriculture, the second one is also about the market access from the emerging market. So I think some issues related to Doha development agenda is still pretty relevant. About 3 years ago, I was in the high-level panel of trade with Jagdish Bhagwati and Peter Sutherland. And sort of like we produce a report, the so-called The Last Chance for Doha. And one important thing on the message on that report is, in order to invite many countries, emerging economies, to get involved in the trade agreement, there should be an incentive from the supply side in terms of the aid for trade. And Doha development also discussed about this issue. But the most important one is, I still believe that, you know, the multilateral solutions will maybe, create a sort of like a plausible solution for some issues, the sensitive issues about agriculture. The other thing is, every regional agreement always talk about WTO plus, right? If you're talking about WTO plus, then you don't have the benchmark about the WTO itself. Then you cannot have this WTO plus. So it is very, very important for us to sort of like to ensure that this Doha agenda development still continue.
Interesting. Mr. President, didn't leave you out. Talk to us about, of course, Chile was one of the proponents, original proponents of TPP, yet as a country you're also pushing for the Pacific Alliance. How do you make these two things work together?
Well, one thing that occurs when the world is facing problems, that a lot of protectionist force appear everywhere. We have to be able to control and defeat them, and that's why this is a time to push forward free trade at every level. In the case of Chile, of course,
Let me interrupt you. Are you surprised, though, first, that since the crisis erupted, the great financial crisis, we actually have not seen much evidence of protectionism globally?
Yes, because we have been extremely concerned about that, and that's one of the main targets of the G20 meetings and the APEC meetings, because otherwise you would have seen exactly what happened in the world in the 1930 after the crisis, that protections appeared everywhere. So we have to be very careful, because that's a real enemy, and we have to have it to keep it under control. But in the case of Chile, we are founders of the TPP, because the TPP is based in what it was called the P4, which was the first effort of economic integration of countries in both sides of the Pacific Ocean. Those were Singapore, New Zealand, Brunei, and Chile. And we have added to that the US, Canada, Mexico, Peru, Indonesia, Malaysia, and many other countries. So we are pushing that TPP. We won't be able to announce an agreement in this APEC meeting. But it doesn't mean that we are not committed to move forward. Of course, there are some problems. One of them is intellectual property rights. We need to protect intellectual property rights, of course. Otherwise, who will invest in that industry? The question is how much, how long? And that's something which has been discussed, and we haven't been able to reach an agreement on that yet, but I'm sure that we will. With respect to the Pacific Alliance, that's an extremely successful experience. Very young. It's 1 year old. But we have already accomplished probably a very deep, not only economic integration, it's not only free trade of goods and services, it's also investment, movement of people, And those 4 countries, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, represent more than 50% of total trade of Latin America and more than 200 million people. Together, the 4 economies would be today the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world. And there we are moving very rapidly because we share the same values and the same views. And by the way, since we're talking about free trade, I would like to invite the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, because we have free trade agreements with almost every country in the world. One of the countries that we are really interested in starting negotiation is Indonesia. So I would like to, since we have all these witnesses, to invite you to do that. And
No pressure. Yeah, no pressure.
And I understand that that smile is a yes.
But what do you say?
Well, it is very important to look at the relationship between ASEAN and then Latin America. Yeah, I think it's probably about a year ago we organized a sort of like meeting to explore the possibility between ASEAN and Latin America. I think this is really one of the potential that we need to explore.
Mr. President, back to the TPP, if we... Yes.
That's a yes or a no?
Oh, you're not giving up. All right, go ahead. I'll just sit back and you two guys go at it. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think, Mr. President, Indonesia has its own roadmap about some Asia-Pacific economies, but we are exploring about this, some possibilities with the Latin American countries as well. We are in the early stage to explore this possibility. I hope I address your question.
That's why I like these panels. Anyway, okay, Mr. President, back to TPP if we could. I was at a private dinner last night and we were talking about precedents. NAFTA came up and the opposition publicly to that, we all remember that. And it's incumbent, I think, upon a lot of the governments involved in TPP or who end up being involved in TPP. One of the big challenges is to sell the benefits of this agreement to the people, the populace, societies, voters, right, as governments. One of my problems with TPP for many, many months now has been why it has been so difficult to get a handle on some of the details on some of the issues here. It has not necessarily been done in a very transparent manner, or could have been done much more transparently. There's a lot of talk that even congressmen in the U.S., they don't even know what's going on with TPP. How is that possible? And what do you say when people talk to you about this?
Yeah, that's a good point. We have made a huge progress towards a TPP, but we still have some problems, particularly in the area of intellectual property, in the area of how to force or enforce labor and environment rules. But now we will enter a second stage, which has to be much more transparent, because we will need to share what we have done with our people in our country.
With respect, why second stage now after you've already been through 20
because
rounds
at the beginning you have to,
of talks?
In order to be transparent, you need to be able to show something. You cannot be transparent and say, look, here I am, and I don't know what I want to do.
Okay.
Now we have something to show and share with our Congress and economists and the society, and therefore we are entering a second stage, which won't be easy. Because you know that in every country there are some sectors that want to protect their sector and open up all the other sectors.
Yes.
That's human nature.
Yeah, okay.
And therefore we will have to deal with these pressure groups, which exist everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to do that is that we need to show them that this agreement will be to the best benefit of each and every country. And we need, of course, to reach agreements in areas which have been very difficult. And for that, we will need to be much more flexible. And the US will have to be more flexible, because in this case, there are views which in this case, we are dealing with so many countries that everybody will have to be more flexible in order to be able to reach a good free trade agreement in the Pacific area, because otherwise, we will have to rely on the World Trade Organization, the Doha rounds, which are not going anywhere. And I think that the Trans-Pacific Partnership could become the largest free trade zone in the world.
Yeah, a free trade agreement for the 21st century, for the 22nd century. One other issue that's been very controversial is what's known as ISDS. I'm sure you know, investor state dispute settlement. I was talking to a former USTR official last night who was saying that, look, what's the big deal? This has been around for many years, and historically, there's no precedent to suggest that we should have any fear that this could be abused by corporate interests. And I want to ask Chris this. What it essentially means is, you know, if you're a signatory part of TPP, you don't like a specific country's regulatory environment, you feel shortchanged or abused or whatever, you want to take it to court, you can, and you as a company can end up suing a signatory government. I mean, obviously you're a French company, but I mean, when you hear stuff like this, you think what?
Well, I think you know, the theme of this conference, again, is growth. And so all of this has to be, what are we trying to do TPP for, but to increase growth? I think one of the problems that we have, first of all, is that many economies are now starting to be in transition. So the BRIC countries, for instance, represent a quarter of the world economy. And yet, they have really come to this point largely on the back of lower manufacturing costs and, in some case, resources. Now the BRIC countries are no longer the most competitive in terms of labor costs and having to move to higher value-added industries. So suddenly you're in a negotiation on a treaty and think about which sectors you want to protect and which ones you want to encourage. Well, they may not be the same sectors as you had in the past. And certainly you're going to move to more knowledge-based economies. Regulatory systems are extremely important in this process. And therefore having harmonization of regulatory is extremely important. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the time it takes to develop a drug, it's already 10 years for everybody. But it could take, for instance, between the time the FDA approves a new drug and many other countries, another 4 or 5 years could go by, only just because of regulatory issues. Now, you know, it's the same size dossier and it takes the same amount of time to read. All of us are building manufacturing facilities around the world, and yet our company, which has about 80 facilities in pharmaceuticals, gets audited by probably 60 different countries. You know, if you could actually start, and they're all sending inspectors overseas, it costs an awful lot of money, so you could actually increase this knowledge flow, you could have regulatory harmonization. I'm sure in other sectors this is the case. So nobody wants to sue a signatory government. I think those are kinds of the things, if you don't put something in there that if no other way works, you may have some sort of legal recourse. But I do think this focus on regulatory harmonization is extremely important.
But as a company, you would like to see that provision in?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. Listen, we're going to take a quick break. Our debate here at the APEC Summit continues after this.
In those areas, for that you need to protect, because otherwise who is going to invest?
Welcome back to the APEC Summit, and we continue our discussion, our debate on growth the way forward. And Oleg, let's come back to you. We've just spent the last couple of minutes talking about the merits of free trade systems, or free trade agreements, excuse me. TPP, we've talked about Doha. We haven't exactly talked about RCEP yet, but I'm sure we'll get to it. As a businessman in the get your hands dirty, the upstream and commodities. What does this all mean to you? I mean, how closely are you watching whether somebody, we go with TPP, whether Doha manages to stay alive, whether China pushes their RCEP?
As my colleague mentioned, I think we all talk about growth and quality of the growth, which will finally result in better life standard. And of course, for us, very important how country react, and it's not about just international agreement, but also national regime and performance of national bureaucracy and climate, which we can see. For us, very important how quickly we can bring our costs down and our risk down through this agreement. And this is a key element for anyone who consider investment in emerging market. And as I mentioned, development and proper infrastructure, in resource sector can't be done without government intervention, especially now when market very turbulent. Financial system would be more in distress after quantitative easing. Would end up, and only strong government involvement and policy, how to create incentives for companies like us to invest, could guide us through this turbulent time.
I hate to be rude, but you would say that, wouldn't you? But let me come to you here. We were chuckling during the break just now, and obviously you're not part of the whole TPP initiative. You're trying to revive the Doha.
Well, I think if you're talking about this regional trade agreement, one thing that Indonesia is always look at is about the open regionalism.
Yeah.
Because as I mentioned to you earlier, some sensitive issue you cannot resolve through only the regional agreement, especially if this closed regional system. The other thing, if you look at the RCEP, in terms of the volume of trade, it's probably you are talking about 30% or even probably about 40% of the global trade over the world. Basically, you are talking about a very largest group of economies, member of this RCEP. But I think the most important one is about the commitment for each country to move forward that. And I think this has been discussed in the last leaders meeting in ASEAN Summit last year in Phnom Penh about some sort of like notable step that we are preparing for the RCEP.
Would it be fair to say that the RCEP is probably more politically realistic, realistically achievable, well, politically, than say something as TPP?
Martin, there's always a trade-off between the quality of the agreement with the number of this member of the group. For example, like when I mentioned about Doha, Doha is the lowest common denominator, if you put on the trade agreement. If you want to put RCEP in the similar context as well, it should be a lowest common denominator in order to each country to get involved on that. Because without that, if you're talking about any particular trade agreement, then you cannot have a benchmark, and not many countries would like to participate on that one.
Interesting. And you're okay if it's lower standard, lower quality?
Well, you should start from the sort of like getting any countries to get together on that process, Because in my view, this is my experience in the policy making process. When you start with something very high standard and not many countries get involved on that, then the question is you end up with not with the open regionalism, but the closed regionalism. Then this might create a sort of like trade diversion rather than trade creation. And this is something that we have to concern about.
Okay, this is a nice way of saying that under RCEP, the dominant power office in China would not impose as many constraints as would exist under the TPP.
Well, I'm not saying that there is no standard, and I'm talking about the RCEP. But if you start with this open regionalism, which more countries get involved, I think, because like it or not, if you're talking about the Asia-Pacific economies, somehow we need to look at the existence of China. China is a very important for the Southeast Asian economy, like it or not. Most of the Southeast Asian country, they export their product to China. China is the largest Indonesia's trading partner. So if you come up with this sort of like open regionalism, that will be beneficial for many Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, for example.
Oleg, let me bring you in on this, and I ask you this question not as a businessman, but as someone who also happens to be, and I think this is well known, very close to the President Putin. China's influence out here economically is obviously growing. In just the last couple of days alone, with the President's visit, I think Indonesia has done $22 billion worth of deals with China, including many in the resource space, correct? This is viewed by Russia how?
Very positive. China, after Europe, most important partner for us. And if you look at Russian map, Russia is not a country, Russia is a continent. And two-thirds of our territory in Asia. And of course, we would love to see that China grows, at a higher rate. And we will definitely share, opportunity with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with Chile, through this, growth in China. It's very important. The more stable China, the more stable Asian Pacific region is.
Okay, are we all?
And the more stable Asia Pacific, the more stable the world.
Okay, all right. All right, gentlemen, we have just a little bit of time left for this particular debate. I want to just swing right through 30 seconds, closing thoughts on growth, where it's going to come from, and how, starting with Chris.
Well, I think, first of all, I would not count out emerging markets. There is an awful lot of focus on macroeconomic indicators, but within countries, there's still significant opportunities. Brazil, for example, is still creating a middle class at double digits, even though the economic growth has gone from 6% to 1%. And the second thing I would say is that you're seeing a resurgence of growth in the developed world, largely because of this innovation and entrepreneurship. And I actually think that a country to be competitive today has to have very competitive universities and is committed to building human capital really through education in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and then investing in those industries that actually utilize those people coming out of those academic institutions.
Okay, which essentially means you need to invest in your people.
Yes.
And starting young.
Absolutely.
Mr. President?
Well, there are so many things that we have to do in order to regain our capacity to grow at 5% and not only 3%, which is the case. Yeah. One thing is that many countries will have to face their own problems at once. All the imbalances in terms of fiscal deficit, current account deficit. That's something that we'll have to deal with by Europe, the US, in one direction, and probably China and other countries in the other direction. But for developing countries, I'm absolutely convinced that if you want to be part of this new society of knowledge and information, we need to build or strengthen those 4 pillars, which I mentioned before. Education is key because we are lagging behind. And without a good quality education, there is nothing that we can do in this society of knowledge and information. But also, of course, there are so many other things, but we need to emphasize the importance of innovation and entrepreneurship, because in many of these countries, the government is not pushing innovation and entrepreneurship, but it's doing just the opposite. And the third thing is science and technology, because otherwise we will lag behind. And there is a big problem of inequalities in many, many developing economies, which has to be addressed, because otherwise nothing will be stable.
Okay, all right. Bob?
Well, if you look at on the composition of the global growth, the APEC economies is contributed about 6.1% of the, to the global growth, whereas some countries in Europe is still struggling with, 0 to 1% growth. Definitely, the role of this emerging market, the role of the APEC economies become very crucial. So I still believe that beyond this, moving the trajectory path back into the equilibrium after the world, after QE, the potential market will be in the emerging market. Then you can talk about this growing middle class. A country like Indonesia, there will be maybe about 135 million people is considered as a middle class. We are talking about the new consuming class, about the business opportunity, and don't forget, 70% of people in Asia-Pacific economies, we live in urban. It's going to create another, a lot of business related to infrastructure, to services, to energy, resources, and everything, and also the consuming class. And this is similar, it also applies to country like Indonesia. And one thing I would like to remind you, Martin, and this is very important, investing in Indonesia is very dangerous because it's addictive.
It's addictive. Oh, I like that. Wow, that's pretty shrewd marketing there. Oleg, last thoughts.
It's clear that the growth will come from United States, and Asia could also add a lot. And key factors, of course, it's energy solution and energy which will reflect a new approach towards environment, because growth middle class will definitely demand proper living standard. And the way energy solution should be developed in the future could definitely reflect need to protect environment, because environment not just air pollution but also it's water, and water will highly affect food, and especially for Asia it would be one of the key factor in the future.
Okay, excellent. I'd like to very quickly thank our panel, Oleg, Khatib, Mr. President Piñera, and also Chris, and thank you folks for watching and joining us here on this debate at the APEC Summit. Okay, so look, don't go away. That was the TV part of it, but you folks are obviously still here. And I promised you at the beginning that we'd bring you in towards the end. So we've got about, I'd say about maybe 10 minutes for questions and answers or Q&A and comments. So feel free. I'm pretty sure there should be microphones running around. So just raise your hand. Ah, there we go. Sir. Just let us know who you are, where you're from, who you represent, and who your comment is directed towards. If we could have a microphone for the gentleman there, please. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Martin. My name is Albert Ting. I'm from Taiwan. I have a question for Minister Basri. I remember hearing Your Excellency in Taipei a few years ago, and I remember I was very impressed. You made a particular point on creating intangible assets through increase of government efficiency. Could you share with us some of the best practices that potentially Indonesia can share with the rest of ASEAN? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your question. As I mentioned in my statement before, one of the important intangible assets in the future will be no longer physical assets, but is the government policy, which create a very conducive investment climate, streamlining the regulations. Martin, jokingly, I keep saying this to my colleague in the cabinet. One of the reasons why many people in Indonesia become religious is because they have to deal with the government. Because every time you submitted the document, you have to wait. And this kind of practices, we cannot continue with this. We have to start with this simplification of the regulations, make it transparent. And we started in some office in Indonesia with the pilot project, and we would like to extend it, to continue. By doing this structural reform, then I do believe that the intangible asset in terms of providing the good or the conducive investment climate that will be, could be implemented.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, right in the center, sir. If we could give this gentleman a microphone, run it over. Excellent, terrific. Yes, good. Yes, sir.
我是中国远东控股集团的创始人，这个董事局主席蒋锡培。我们大家知道，现在的这个国际经济社会发展当中遇到了很多的困难和问题。这个有的讲呢，这些问题和困难呢，都是这个长期资源错配的结果；有的讲是，都是企业家的问题，也有的讲是政治家们这个造成的问题。这个我就想啊，这个请问总统和总理， 你们如何看待这样的评价？你们如何定位与中国的经济关系？谢谢。
Okay, our little translation machine thingies, were they working for you folks? No, they weren't working for me either. So listen, I have to admit, I have to be honest about this. I'm pretty embarrassed. I'm ethnically Chinese myself, but I had absolutely no idea what he was saying. So,
well, that's the best question because you can answer whatever you want.
Well, there you go. Okay.
OK， 现在话筒翻译好了没有？话筒好了没有
I don't think the translation system is quite working. Or are we back on board now?
现在好了。OK。
I tell you what, we'll get back to you.
我是中国远东控股集团的创始人，这个董事局主席蒋锡培。现在大家说，世界经济和社会发生了很多的问题，这些问题是资源长期错配的原因，也有的讲这是企业家们带来的问题和政治家们带来的问题。请问总统和总理，你们如何评价这样的问题？第二，你们如何定位与中国的经贸关系？谢谢。
Okay, I'm sorry, sir. This question was directed towards whom again, please? For Oleg?
总统和总理两位。
For Mr. President.
OK。两个。
Excellent. Okay, Mr. President, were you able to hear the translation?
50%.
50%. Okay. If I mean, I caught about. Listen. I caught about 25%.
Look, there were two questions.
Yeah.
There were two questions.
Yes.
One, how to deal with the environment and at the same time keep the economy growing. And the second question was about the Chinese economy. With respect to the first one, I'm absolutely convinced that there is no conflict between the environment and growth. Because growth in the future will have to be sustainable or it will be no growth at all. And for that, of course, we need to realize that this is not a question that has to be addressed by each country alone. It has to be addressed collectively because many of the problems of the climate change and many others have to be dealt in a joint way, otherwise we won't be efficient. But the good news is that technology has developed so rapidly that really today you can compatibilize growth and good care of the environment. And that's something that every country will have to realize, and we have to set up the rules. One thing that we were discussing at the UN a couple of weeks ago was after the Millennium Goals, what would happen afterwards? And one of the main issues will be how to compatibilize growth with environment, which is sustainable growth. And with respect to the Chinese economy, of course, that China is not growing at 2 digits as it was. But maybe it's impossible to grow forever at 10%. And therefore, we shouldn't consider that as bad news. On the contrary, if they are able to keep growing at 7% at the same time, address their own imbalances and be much more careful with the environment, that would be a very good news for China and for the whole world.
One last question from me. TPP, does it address or encourage environmentally responsible and sustainable growth?
Oh, yes.
It does.
Definitely,
Okay.
yes. That's a key aspect of the TPP.
Okay, and I think the gentleman wanted to respond as well.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank President Penera for translating his question to me. I think I agree very much regarding this environmental issue, but let me try to address about the role of Chinese economy. As I mentioned to you earlier, the role of China is very important. The existence of China, especially in Asia Pacific. If you look at the composition of the export in many countries, if you're talking about Thailand, about Vietnam, about many countries in Southeast Asia, China is a very dominant. That is why many countries in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, always watching about the economic development in China, including the slowing economic growth in the past 2 years. If you grow by about 7 to 7.5%, that will be an impact on Indonesia because maybe around 40% of our export is energy and commodity related, which is somehow affected by the demand from China. So the role of China is definitely very important for the many emerging economies in Asia.
How much of your exports now go to China?
Sorry?
How much of your exports now go to China?
It's about 12%, if I'm not mistaken. 12%.
Okay, interesting. All right, let's try and be fair. We've done the center, we've done the right. Let's do the left here. The gentleman in the front row, sir. No, that's you, yeah. Oh, you're deferring to your colleague there? Okay, no, here we go. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Martin. My name is Roger Hamilton from Entrepreneurs Institute, and I have a question for President Pinera. In my field, which is entrepreneur education, Startup Chile is known around the world as one of the best examples of a government attracting entrepreneurship into their country, especially because you are encouraging people from overseas to come in as well. What would you say are the most important principles for either companies or governments, and our organization is based here in Indonesia, what would you say is the most important principles to create a program to encourage entrepreneurship?
Well, first of all, education and entrepreneurship are very complementary. We are almost increasing by 60% in a 4-year period our investment in education in Chile. And we are undertaking a huge reform at every level of the educational sector, not only university, but also school level and preschool level, in order to guarantee to every Chilean that they will have access to good quality education at every level. That's something that we think is absolutely necessary in order to be able to achieve our goal of becoming a developed country before the end of this decade. Chile is a country with a per capita income of 20,000, which is the highest per capita income in Latin America. Yes. By the way, Chile was in the position number 10 only 10 years ago, something like that, and it was the poorest Spanish colony. So that's something which is based in those intangibles that the Minister of Finance was talking before. And with respect to entrepreneurship, we have this program which is called Startup Program, by which we are trying to import entrepreneurs, innovators, from all over the world. What we do is that we have a kind of competition, and the best projects are selected, and we give those people not only a scholarship, which is a $40,000 scholarship so they can initiate their investment or the project in Chile, but also we give them many other facilities, and it has proved to be extremely successful because we are attracting the best ideas and the best innovators from all over the world. And once they come to Chile, they start to irradiate that knowledge, that attitude to many, many other Chileans. And therefore, we have done a huge reform in order to promote entrepreneurship. One of the aspects of this reform that in Chile today, you can create a company in one day with no cost. So it's a very simple way. That's why we are moving up in the doing business ranking, which is done by an international organization very rapidly, because normally governments do not promote entrepreneurship. On the opposite, they put problems and problems and problems. And that's something which we have changed to change our culture, because if we do not promote innovation and entrepreneurship, everything else won't work either. So there are many, many things that we have to address, to be addressed simultaneously, if we want to make this big change from underdevelopment to developed country. Because you were telling us the experience of Jamaica and Singapore, of course. And Jamaica has more natural resources than Singapore, because Singapore has none. Yeah. And therefore, if you had to make a bet 50 years ago, Jamaica would have been picked. And the situation is just the opposite, because I think that Singapore is a very good experience to study and to learn from.
Okay, Mr. President, with that, we'll have to leave it. I've been told to wrap this up. Thank you so much also to Chris, Pak Khatib, and Oleg, and thank you all for being a part of this.